Well, good day, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. This was an interesting project I started this week. It was initiated during our Sunday morning typewriter club meeting. And I think it was William from Canada had mentioned that he likes to make his own index cards. The lines are spaced typewriter compatible, 6 lines per inch. He uses those cards to document data about each one of his typewriters, name, brand, serial number, etc., etc. And that got me thinking about lined paper, ruled paper, and typewriters. Let's talk about it. Stay tuned. Well, before we get into this, it might be a good time to ask the question, what do you need ruled lines for with a typewriter? Well, in the case of William, in our meeting, his use was, of course, to be able to have nice ruling so he could put his data about his typewriters. So it's a little database card file system that he was using. But also, perhaps you like the look of typing within ruled lines, but you know, if you use standard notebook filler paper, I don't know personally of any line ruling notebooks or paper that comes in at either 3 or 6 lines to the vertical inch. So what you end up doing is you start typing in the middle between the lines, and then when you get down a couple lines, it starts to shift on you, right? And so maybe there's a particular application you're using with a typewriter other than just like creative writing or journaling or whatever, that you might want lines. It might be some kind of data or information, or maybe you're writing a genealogy or something, and you would like ruled lines with typewritten text between them. So that's kind of the main reason, I think, why it might be fun to use ruled lines with a typewriter once in a while. So this started out as a project where I wanted to show you basically how to make ruled paper using your typewriter or a few other methods we'll talk about. And as I started using 4 or 5 different typewriters for this test, I soon discovered something interesting, that the line spacings in these various typewriters are not all the same. They're all supposed to be approximately 6 lines per inch vertically, but it turns out there's a little bit of a difference between all of them, and one typewriter in particular is really oddball, which surprised me. It's something I hadn't really paid attention to. So first of all, what I had to do is I had to figure out 6 lines per inch. How do you make a 6 line per inch ruled paper? There are several different ways to do it. One of the ways you could do is with an engineering scale, such as this Charvaz German-made engineering scale that I've had in my little drafting kit since high school in the early 1970s. So if you look at the 30 scale, that would be essentially really close to 3 major divisions per inch, which would equate to double spacing. Another way to do ruled lines, of course, you could make a template in a word processing program on your computer, and if you scale it properly and make the lines appropriate, you can get pretty close to 6 lines per inch or 3 lines per inch if you're doing double spacing ruling. But the other way that you can do this line spacing is actually use your typewriter, because most typewriters have either a notch or a hole in the card guide near the ribbon vibrator, and you can use the typewriter itself to create the lines. And that's kind of what I did. I did actually also did another method. I sat down and figured out how to draw an inch line that was trisected into 3 parts. So to trisect a line into 3 equal parts, you draw the line from one end, which we're calling point A. You draw a radius equal to that line length, right? Draw a circle with a compass. And with point B, you draw the same length line, a circle, right? And then where the 2 circles intersect up here, you draw a 3rd circle with the same AB radius, like this. Where the 2 circles intersect up here, you're going to draw a line through that point to the perimeter of the 3rd circle. You'll do the same thing from the other side through the intersection point. And then where these 2 points are, you draw a line down to the bottom intersection point of the 2 circles. And where they cross the first line, that divides it into 3 equal parts. It turns out to be very close to 8.5 millimeters. That's the alternative, is you could use a figure roughly around 8.5 millimeters, which is about as accurate as you can get drawing by hand. So I did that, and I drew up a template here with pencil with that 8.5 millimeter spacing, and then I compared that with 3 different typewriters here, and also went through and made lines on each typewriter using the card guide hole. I started by doing some test typing with various typewriters using this 8.5 millimeter hand-drawn scale. The left-hand column here is using the Smith Corona Silent Super, and it's set to the double line spacing mode, which is 3 lines per inch, which is what these graduations are. The first line where it says 1, there's just a little bit of space between the bottom of the letters and the line below it. And as you follow that through, there is a little bit of inconsistency, I think, that is probably due to the way I drew the lines with a mechanical pencil. By and large, as you go down the paper here, you can probably see that as we get down toward the bottom, it's maintaining pretty much that same gap between the bottom of the line and the line below it. So I think for the purposes of comparison here, the Smith Corona Silent Super, my particular copy of the Smith Corona Silent Super, is very, very close to the 8.5 millimeter spacing. And if I was to make a template for typing on, I would be probably pleased just to use an 8.5 millimeter line spacing with it. Silent Super is a Elite 12 character per inch typeface. The Royal Mercury of mine is a pica. Again, it has ostensibly 6 lines per vertical inch. And I started the top line here very close to the same amount of space above the line as the Silent Super. And as you progress down here, you might be able to tell that the texts are slowly being printed higher and higher above the bottom line. So by the time you get to the 28th line down here, the text is at the halfway point or slightly higher in the line. And you can see now the difference between the Silent Super and the Mercury in terms of where the spacing ends up at. The third test that I did with this is I used my early 1960s Hermes 3000. The 1 is right above the line. And as we move down now, you might be able to see, like, by the time we get to 12, now there is a noticeable gap between the bottom of the text and the line below it. And as we continue down further, that gap gets slightly larger and larger. By the time we get to 28, you can see there's definitely a larger gap between the bottom of text and the ruled line below it. So now you can kind of see the difference between the 3 machines. All 3 supposed to be 6 lines per inch vertically. The Silent Super is closest to being equivalent to 8.5 millimeter spacing. The Royal Mercury space is a little bit shorter, and the Hermes 3000 is somewhere between these 2. So the basic question I was trying to answer is, could this be usable with a lot of different typewriters? And the answer is probably yes. For most typewriters, the difference between the top of the page here and the bottom of the page, there's only a slight amount of difference, especially if you're doing this double line spacing where you have plenty of room for the text to slowly move up or down as the line spacing is not quite perfectly 8.5 millimeters based on your machine. At least in my sample of these 3 machines, an 8.5 millimeter page would be okay. You could make a generic template in that spacing, and it looks like it would work for a number of different machines. The next thing I wanted to do was to start drawing actual ruled lines using the hole or notch in the card guide of each specific machine and see how that worked. Okay, so this is the Smith Corona Silent Super. I'm going to roll a sheet of paper in. This era of Silent Super, which is the early 1950s, you might notice there's no actual hole in the card guide. There's just the corner of the finger right here on either side. And so the trick to doing lines with this machine is you have to keep the pencil in the same corner and not let it drift. Pull the carriage back like that. It requires a little bit of precision. You have to keep your pencil carefully aligned on that corner. It's not a sharp corner, it's kind of rounded, so it's easy for pencil or pen to slip up or down or sideways. So that's the trick with this technique, is being accurate with it. But there are other machines that make it a little bit easier because they actually have a hole in the card guide instead of just a little notch. Okay, this is the Royal Mercury. Let's feed our sheet of paper into that. Set it to 2 line spacing. Okay, the Mercury has this little triangular guide with a hole in it, and that in theory should give us a pretty accurate line spacing. In practice, you still have to be a little bit accurate with being consistent with the pencil. And of course, I don't have my margins set all that well. But do the carriage return, hold your pencil at the same angle, etc., etc. And so as we look at that, you can see there's a very slight drifting of the height as I first start out, but you have to kind of be very consistent with the angle of your pencil. Okay, the Hermes 3000, the early 1960s version. It has holes on either side on the card guide here and here. But there is a little bit of a distance. You can maybe see the motion there. So depending on how you press it down, it actually moves the hole up or down a little bit. So you have to be kind of really consistent about how you hold your pencil and the kind of pressure you're applying to the card guide. I basically use my mechanical pencil and I push it up toward the top edge of the hole because the pencil lead itself is a lot smaller than the hole. So you want to keep it pushed to the top of the hole. Anyway, keep your pencil pushed up to the top of the holder notch or the bottom. At least be consistent about the pressure. And like that. And you should get some pretty consistent rulings. The fourth machine that we used for this comparison was the Groma Colibri. This is a pica typeface, and what I found interesting about the Colibri was its line spacing is nowhere close to the others. You can see starting with the middle text here, with the top line in the middle of the rulings, by the time you get down just 5 or 6 lines down, you're already shifted down near the bottom of the field. And now by the time you go to this point here at number 8, it's already touching the line. So the Groma Colibri has a really strange line spacing. And so because of that, I made a couple other tests with the Groma Colibri. It has 1 and 1.5 line spacing, even though on the machine itself it says 1 and 2. So this is the setting that says 2, but it's actually 1.5. And you can see that it starts itself here on the top line, and by the time it gets to the bottom, it's very consistently the same. So it's consistent to itself, which means there's really nothing slipping that I can see. And I compared that to the Hermes 3000 that also has a 1.5 line setting. And as you can see, we start up here on the top, and very quickly you can start to see the letters are now drifting up to the top of the field, where by the time it hits 14, the F is touching the top line. So clearly, the rulings on the line spacing on the Groma Colibri is wider than a standard typewriter. Then I did a double line spacing test with the Groma Colibri. It doesn't have a double line setting, but this is basically 2 single line carriage returns representing each of these double spaces. And you can see, first of all, the Colibri stays very consistent to itself. Starting here, as you go down, the space between the bottom of the letters and the ruling below it is very consistent from top to bottom. So there's nothing really slipping on the Groma Colibri. It's very consistent. But again, with the Hermes 3000, you can see that it easily drifts out. So by the time you get down here to 13 or 14, it's touching the top line. Again, the Colibri is an oddball line spacing. It does not appear to conform to the standard 6 lines per vertical inch. And this is the Groma Colibri. We'll feed a piece of paper into it. Get it set. So the Colibri has these 2 triangular openings for the card guide, but there's quite a bit of space between the triangular opening and the actual paper. So with the Colibri here, it's really important that you keep your pencil held at the right angle, the correct angle. If you angle it this way or that way, you're going to make a big, huge difference in the vertical position of the line itself. So you want to keep the pencil pushed up toward the V of the notch, so you're always in the same position, relatively speaking. So I wanted to try measuring a little bit more precisely what is the line spacing on the Groma Colibri. So I'm using the metric scale, and it looks to me like at the 17th line here, which is 15 centimeters from the start, that is basically the 34th line. So 34 single-space lines is 15 centimeters, 150 millimeters, really closely. Now, one of the problems with using the plastic card guide holes is some machines, the card guides are broken. In the case of this Olivetti Studio 45, the left card guide here, the inner part of it is snapped off, so I have to use the right side. Even so, it's kind of a delicate device, and the plastic is fragile, and it's riveted to a strip of metal down below there. So again, just be careful with it. And again, the hole size here is much bigger than mechanical pencil, so you want to kind of keep your pencil pushed up toward the top of the hole, at least consistently, and use the same angle of the pencil to the platen, relatively speaking. It helps to hold your hand against the machine like I'm doing here and just move the carriage back and forth and be as consistent as you can with your hand position. Well, since we have our engineering scale with us, let's just see how close it measures. So the top 4 lines were from, I think it was the Silent Super, and it looks to me like the line spacing is a half of whatever the heck these little divisions are. It's almost like a half a millimeter. I know this isn't metric, but it's like about half a millimeter shy of being the 1/3 of an inch. And then if you go to the next typewriter, what was it, the Royal Mercury? So the Royal Mercury looks like it is really close to being the 1/3 of an inch. Hermes 3000 looks okay, although I think if you compare, it's these 3 lines here, it looks like it's a little shy of the 1/3 of an inch. It ends a little short here and ends a little short here. Yeah, it's funny. As a typewriter user and typewriter fanatic, vertical line spacing is something I've really kind of taken for granted. I think a lot of us are much more conscious of horizontal line spacing, horizontal character spacing, than vertical. But the comparisons here are really interesting. So a number of my machines are pretty close, but it looks like none of these are exactly 6 lines per inch spacing in the single line mode, or 3 lines per inch in the double line spacing mode. They're all close except for the Groma Colibri, the outlier. They're all close, but they're not exact. So what does that mean? Well, I think if you're doing like index cards or some kind of small piece of paper with just a few, less than a dozen lines, it probably doesn't really matter. You could make an 8.5 millimeter ruling. You could make it a 1/3 of an inch with an engineering scale. You could do it on a graphical program on your computer and print them out on your printer, or you could do them on the typewriter itself. And for most small pieces of paper, it's probably fine, either one of those methods. But if you're doing an entire page, right, letter-size page from top to bottom with ruling like that, and you want to keep the text lined up pretty well, it looks like the best way to go is to use the machine itself that you're going to be making the typings with. Use that to do the rulings. And you may have to do some testing, right? Just like I did. I was surprised to find that my Colibri was an oddball line spacing, though several other machines are pretty close to each other. There's still some difference. And as I keep reiterating, the accuracy with which you use your pen or pencil in the card guide hold has a lot to do with how well this works. And also the little sprocket, the tooth sprocket on the left side of your platen that does the line spacing, how well that spring-loaded roller is seated into the sprocket, how consistent the pressure is, how consistently it lines up has something to do also. I used to have an Olympia SF, and it had a problem where when you did a carriage return, the first maybe ½ inch of the line, the characters were a little higher, and then they drifted down and settled in. And the reason was because that spring-loaded roller wasn't seated quite right on the line spacing sprocket. But this is one of those things where you don't really notice there's a problem until you find out that, oh darn, I do the comparison, one machine to another. Take 3 or 4 machines out of your collection, the most likely machines you're going to use for this kind of thing, and you compare them and you see, darn, there is a difference between them. And that's kind of surprising. Well, there you go. We have a few options if we want to type on ruled paper. and have the lines of text stay evenly inside the lines. You know, we were always told in school, right? Write on the lines, stay in the lines, right? But hey, sometimes rules are meant to be broken. And for that reason, one of my other favorite methods of typing on line paper, when it's a standard, let's say, 1/4-inch ruling or some kind of ruling that doesn't line up with a typewriter's ruling, is I turn the paper sideways or I fold it in half. I type sideways to the line so the lines are now going vertical, and I kind of like doing that. That's kind of fun to do also. Well, there you go, at a little bit of a rabbit hole discussion about vertical line spacing on typewriters, something you might not have thought about too much. Well, there you go. It might be fun for you to take out a couple of machines out of your collection and start playing around with vertical line spacing and see what you discover. Is one of your machines more consistent than the other? Do you want to do a hand-drawn template and maybe Xerox copy it or scan it and print it on your printer? You're going to do a template on your computer with a word processing, a graphic program? Either of those methods will probably work, but you got to get the right line spacing. So have fun with this, guys. Stay well, stay creative, and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye for now.